It was a quiet Friday night in September, and Kayla, a 24-year-old graphic designer, was enjoying a rare evening off in her small one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of San Antonio, Texas. She had recently moved into the modest house to embrace her independence, and though the neighborhood seemed peaceful, living alone still carried an underlying unease. The soft glow of the television lit up her living room as she lounged on the couch, a half-eaten slice of pizza resting on the coffee table and her favorite crime documentary playing in the background. Outside, the night was still, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. Around 10 p.m., a sharp knock on the door interrupted her tranquility. Kayla froze. Visitors were rare, especially this late, and the lack of noise outside, no approaching car or footsteps, made the situation even stranger. The knock came again, louder this time, jolting her out of her thoughts. Cautiously, she muted the television, crept to the door, and peeked through the peephole. A woman, appearing to be in her late 30s, stood on the dimly lit porch. She wore a worn hoodie and jeans, her dark hair tied in a messy ponytail. Her demeanor wasn't overtly threatening, but something about her presence felt off. "Hi," the woman called out, noticing movement behind the door. Her voice was light but tinged with urgency. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I'm your neighbor from a few houses down. My phone died, and I need to call my husband. It's kind of an emergency." Kayla hesitated. She had lived in the house for nearly 8 months and was familiar with most of the neighbors in passing, but this woman wasn't one of them. Her instincts whispered for her to keep the chain locked, but guilt crept in at the thought of ignoring someone who might genuinely need help. She cracked the door open slightly, the security chain still intact. "I don't think we've met before," Kayla said cautiously. "Which house did you move into?" The woman's smile widened, unnaturally so, as if she were trying too hard to appear harmless. "Oh, I just moved in 2 houses down last week. I'm really sorry to disturb you. I just need to make a quick call. It'll only take a minute, I promise." Kayla's gut told her something wasn't right. The smile didn't reach the woman's eyes, and her repeated glances toward the street made Kayla's skin prickle with unease. Still, not wanting to come across as rude or paranoid, she unlatched the chain and opened the door. The woman stepped inside immediately, as though she had been waiting for permission. The move was so swift that Kayla barely had time to process her regret. Inside, the woman didn't behave like someone in distress. She didn't glance around or acknowledge the cozy decor of the room. Instead, she stood stiffly in the entryway, her hands buried deep in the front pocket of her hoodie. Her gaze shifted to the door as if she were waiting for something or someone. Kayla's heart began to race. She tried to break the tension. "The phone's on the coffee table," she said, gesturing toward it. "You can use it." The woman didn't move immediately. She lingered in place, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though weighing her options. Then, with deliberate slowness, she walked toward the coffee table. She didn't pick up the phone. Instead, she turned to face Kayla, and her entire demeanor shifted. The friendly facade disappeared, replaced by an icy, calculating stare. Kayla's blood ran cold. Without a word, the woman pulled a large, folding knife from her hoodie pocket, the blade glinting under the dim light. "Sit down," she said, her voice now steady and devoid of the previous pretense. Kayla instinctively stepped back, her hands raised in an attempt to de-escalate. "Hey, take it easy," she said, her voice trembling. "If it's money you need, I can give you some. Just, let's not do anything drastic." The woman didn't respond, her grip tightening on the knife. She gestured toward the couch with a slight nod. "Sit," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Heart pounding, Kayla obeyed, her mind racing for a way out. The knife glinted menacingly, a stark reminder of her vulnerability. She cursed herself for leaving her phone out of reach, stranded on the coffee table. The woman, now standing between Kayla and the door, seemed to steady her victim's every move, a quiet tension filling the room. The sound of footsteps on the porch made Kayla's stomach drop. She glanced toward the door, and her worst fears were confirmed when the woman turned and waved. A shadowed figure approached quickly. Get him, the woman barked toward the door. The realization hit Kayla like a freight train. This wasn't random. It was planned, orchestrated. Without a second thought, she leapt from the couch and bolted toward the back of the house. Behind her, the woman's voice rang out, furious. "Don't let him get away." Kayla sprinted into the kitchen, her bare feet skidding on the tile floor as she fumbled with the lock on the back door. She yanked it open and darted into the backyard, the cold night air biting at her skin. Adrenaline propelled her as she scaled the fence, ignoring the sting of splinters and scrapes. On the other side, she landed in her neighbor's yard and kept running, her lungs burning with every frantic breath. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest house with lights on. Pounding on the door, she shouted for help, her voice raw with panic. An elderly couple answered, their concerned faces a beacon of hope. The husband ushered her inside while his wife dialed the police. By the time officers arrived, the intruders were gone. They searched Kayla's house and found no sign of the group, though footprints in the backyard suggested they had fled when the situation went awry. The police informed her that similar crimes had been reported in the area, teams working together to lure homeowners into letting their guard down. Most of these incidents didn't end as safely. Kayla moved out of the house within weeks, unable to shake the memory of how close she had come to disaster. The experience left her hypervigilant, her trust in strangers irreparably fractured. Even now, years later, she double-checks every lock and hesitates to answer her door, the woman's cold stare and gleaming knife forever etched into her mind. The man's hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the door before I could close it fully. "Look, ma'am, I'm just trying to do my job," he said, his tone shifting sharply from polite to aggressive. The forced friendliness drained from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating expression that sent a shiver down my spine. My heart pounded as I tightened my grip on the door, suddenly hyper-aware of how vulnerable I was. The man leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing, and I realized with growing panic that his demeanor wasn't just pushy, it was threatening. "I'll need to call my landlord to confirm," I said firmly, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. I hoped the mention of an authority figure might deter him, but instead, his grip on the doorframe tightened. "You don't need to do that," he said in a low, menacing voice, his smile completely gone now. "Just let me in. I'll be done in 10 minutes. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming now. This wasn't right. This wasn't safe. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I shoved the door hard, forcing his hand away as I slammed it shut. My hand shook as I locked the deadbolt and pressed my weight against the door, as though my small frame could somehow reinforce the barrier between us. Outside, the man pounded on the door with his fist, his voice rising in anger. I couldn't make out what he was shouting, but the tone was enough to terrify me. I stumbled back, grabbing my phone from the counter and dialing 911. My fingers fumbled on the screen as I tried to explain the situation to the operator, my voice a mixture of panic and urgency. "There's a man at my door," I whispered, barely able to keep my breathing steady. "He's trying to get in. Please send someone quickly." The operator stayed on the line, her calm voice a faint source of reassurance as I crouched behind the kitchen counter, out of sight from the front windows. I could still hear the man outside, pacing on the porch, muttering angrily to himself. Every second felt like an eternity, and I clutched my phone tightly, willing the police to arrive faster. Suddenly, the pounding stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the house. I strained to hear any movement, my heart hammering in my chest. Had he left? Or was he trying to find another way in? The thought made my blood run cold. I crept toward the back of the house, peeking through the blinds to see if he had gone around to the backyard. To my relief, there was no sign of him, but I didn't feel safe enough to let my guard down. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed outside as a patrol car pulled into the driveway. The sight of the officers stepping out of their vehicle brought a wave of relief, though my hands were still trembling as I unlocked the door to let them in. I quickly explained what had happened, recounting every detail while trying to catch my breath. The officers searched the property and the surrounding area, but the man was nowhere to be found. They did, however, discover muddy footprints leading from the front porch to the side yard, as though he had considered trying to enter through a window before abandoning the attempt. The officers assured me they would increase patrols in the area and urged me to be cautious, offering advice on how to reinforce my home security. As they left, one of them turned to me and said, "You did the right thing by not letting him in. Trust your instincts, they might have saved your life tonight." Despite their reassurances, I felt anything but safe. The man's cold stare and aggressive demeanor were burned into my memory, and the thought of how easily the situation could have escalated left me shaken to my core. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house and rustle of leaves outside made me jump, my mind conjuring images of him lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity. Over the next few days, I took every precaution I could think of. I installed a deadbolt on the back door, reinforced the windows with locks, and even bought a security camera to monitor the front porch. Still, the lingering fear was hard to shake. Every time I left the house, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the faces of strangers for any sign of familiarity. The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that he might come back. A week later, my worst fears were realized. It was late at night, and I had just settled into bed when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my window. My stomach dropped, and I froze, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the house as if the person was carefully examining each window. My breath hitched as I heard a faint tapping on the glass, followed by the sound of the window frame creaking. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 again, my voice trembling as I whispered to the operator. "He's back," I said, barely able to get the words out. "He's trying to get in." The operator assured me that officers were on their way and instructed me to find a safe place to hide. I crept out of bed and into the closet, pulling the door shut behind me and clutching my phone like a lifeline. My entire body was trembling as I listened to the sounds outside, every noise amplified by the silence of the house. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and the footsteps outside stopped abruptly. I heard a commotion near the front of the house, voices shouting and the sound of a struggle. When I finally emerged from the closet, heart still pounding, I found the officers standing in my living room. They had caught the man trying to flee through the backyard, and he was now in handcuffs, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. The officers later informed me that the man had been linked to several attempted home invasions in the area and was wanted for questioning in connection with a string of burglaries. Hearing this only deepened my sense of unease. I had narrowly avoided becoming another victim, but the thought of how close I had come to danger was enough to keep me on edge for weeks. Even now, the memory of that night lingers. I've moved to a new house, one with better security and a more tightly knit community, but the fear hasn't entirely faded. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in the neighborhood, sends a chill down my spine. Living alone was supposed to be empowering, a chance to embrace my independence, but now it feels like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next threat to appear. Late that night, I jolted upright at the sound of a loud knock reverberating through the house, slicing through the stillness like a blade. The clock on my wall read just past midnight, and an uneasy wave of confusion washed over me. Nobody came by at this hour, least of all unannounced. My heart began to pound, its rhythm quickening with each passing second of silence. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. Perhaps someone had the wrong house, or a neighbor needed help. Yet, as I sat frozen on the couch, my instincts whispered something darker. This felt off. Hesitantly, I stood, my legs shaky as I approached the door. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a man standing there. He appeared to be in his late 30s, dressed in a dark hoodie pulled tight around his face, casting shadows over his features. He wasn't moving much, just standing there with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look like a neighbor, or anyone I recognized, for that matter. "Who is it?" I called through the door, trying to sound steady, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. The man lifted his head slightly, his expression hidden in the dim light of my porch lamp. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he replied, his tone forced, too casual to be genuine. "My car broke down a couple blocks away, and my phone's dead. I just need to borrow yours real quick to call for help." Something about his voice made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the words, but the way he spoke them, a rehearsed ease that felt practiced rather than sincere. "There's a gas station just down the street," I responded, trying to keep my voice neutral. "They'll have a phone you can use." There was a pause, a beat too long, and I watched through the peephole as he shifted his weight, glancing over his shoulder before looking back at the door. "Yeah, I know, but it's late, and I don't really feel safe walking alone," he said, his tone dipping into something softer, almost pleading. "It'll only take a minute, I promise." Every instinct in me screamed to keep the door locked, to walk away and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but a part of me hesitated. What if he really was stranded? What if he genuinely needed help? I'd feel terrible if I turned him away. But then, as he stepped closer to the door, I noticed something, a slight shift in his demeanor. His shoulders squared, his posture stiffened, and his polite facade faltered, just for a moment. "I'm sorry," I said firmly, gripping the door handle as if it were my lifeline. "I can't help you. Please leave." Another pause. This time, the silence felt heavier, thicker, as if the very air between us had turned hostile. "Come on," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Just open the door. It's not a big deal." The forced politeness was gone now, replaced by a cold edge that sent chills down my spine. I took a step back, panic beginning to claw its way into my chest. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice louder now, steadier, though fear twisted in my gut. His response was immediate, a scoff, low and guttural, followed by a sharp bang against the door. "You don't need to do that," he said, his words dripping with menace. "Just let me in. I'll be done in 10 minutes. My hands shook as I slammed the deadbolt into place and locked the chain, my breath coming in shallow gasps. He pounded on the door again, harder this time, each thud reverberating through the quiet house. "Open the door," he yelled, his voice rising with frustration. I stumbled back, grabbing my phone from the coffee table and dialing 911. The operator's calm voice on the other end was a lifeline, grounding me as I explained the situation, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The operator assured me help was on the way and told me to stay on the line, but the pounding on the door made it hard to focus. "He's trying to get in," I whispered, tears streaming down my face as I clutched the phone. "Please hurry." Minutes felt like hours as I crouched behind the kitchen counter, the sound of my own heartbeat nearly drowning out the commotion at the front door. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Silence fell over the house, oppressive and unnerving. I strained to listen, my ears picking up faint footsteps retreating down the porch steps. Was he gone? Or was this a trick? I didn't dare move until I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, their wailing cries growing louder as they approached. Relief flooded through me as red and blue lights illuminated the street outside, the flashing glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. I unlocked the door with trembling hands, letting the officers in as I tried to explain what had happened. They searched the property, shining their flashlights into every dark corner, but the man was gone. All they found were muddy footprints leading away from the porch and a cigarette butt discarded near the driveway. "You did the right thing calling us," one of the officers said, his voice firm yet sympathetic. "People like this don't usually just stop. He might come back, so stay vigilant." For a moment, I let myself believe it was over, that I'd scared him off for good. But 2 nights later, I realized just how wrong I was. It was around 1 a.m., and I was lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, trying to lull myself to sleep. The blinds on my bedroom window were partially open, letting in a faint glow from the street lamp outside. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind stirring the branches of the tree in the yard. But then, it happened again, this time, unmistakable. Someone was standing just outside my window. My heart seized in my chest as I turned my head, praying I was imagining things. But there he was, the same man from the other night, his face partially illuminated by the dim light. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring through the glass. His eyes were cold, unblinking, and the sight of him sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911 again, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. "He's here," I whispered, my voice cracking. "The guy from before, he's outside my window." The operator's calm instructions barely registered as I kept my eyes locked on him, too afraid to look away. He didn't flinch, didn't react, even as the faint sound of sirens began to approach. It wasn't until the flashing lights of the police cars came into view that he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. The officers searched the area again, finding more footprints and cigarette butts near the backyard fence. It was clear he had been watching me for a while, waiting for the right moment. A week later, they caught him after he broke into another woman's house a few streets over. She managed to escape and called the police, leading to his arrest. When the officers updated me, their words chilled me to the bone. "You're lucky you called us when you did," one of them said. "This guy's been targeting women living alone. He's already wanted for multiple assaults." I moved out of that house within a month, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, in my new home with reinforced locks and security cameras, I can't escape the fear. Every shadow feels like a threat, every knock at the door a potential danger. Living alone was supposed to be liberating, a chance to embrace my independence. Instead, it's become a constant reminder of how fragile safety truly is. It started with a knock, the kind that seems louder than it should in the stillness of the night. My heart skipped a beat as I sat frozen on the couch, staring at the door. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as nothing, a passerby, a neighbor, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Slowly, I stood and made my way toward the door, each step careful and deliberate. Peering through the peephole, I spotted a man standing on the porch, his head tilted down and his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of a worn hoodie. He looked rough, as though he hadn't slept or shaved in days. His clothes were shabby but not enough to scream homelessness. Something about him just felt off. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady, though my fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of the door. The man's head lifted slightly, and he forced a thin smile that didn't reach his tired eyes. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said, his tone almost too polite, too measured. "My car broke down a couple of blocks away. My phone's dead, and I just need to make a quick call. Could I use yours?" His words were calm, but something in his voice felt wrong, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. I hesitated, trying to process the situation. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable request, but alarm bells rang in my head. Why hadn't he gone to the gas station just down the road? Why stop here, of all places, when there were so many other houses nearby? "I'm sorry," I replied firmly, my unease creeping into my voice. "I can't help you. There's a gas station down the street where you can get assistance." He didn't move. For a moment, he just stood there, his hands still buried in his pockets. Then, instead of walking away, he leaned closer to the door, his voice dropping an octave. "Please," he said, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. "I've been walking for a while, and I'm really not feeling well. Just one quick call, that's all I'm asking. I'm not asking for a ride or anything." His plea sent a shiver down my spine. Something about his insistence made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My instincts screamed at me to keep the door closed, but I felt trapped, unsure how to respond. "I'm really sorry," I repeated, trying to keep my voice firm. "I can't help you." The pause that followed felt agonizingly long. I could hear his heavy breathing through the door, a tense silence that stretched on for what felt like minutes. Then, under his breath, I heard him mutter something, though I couldn't make out the words. Before I could react, the doorknob rattled, a subtle movement at first, but then harder, more insistent. My stomach dropped as I realized he was trying to force his way in. My heart raced as I stumbled back from the door, panic gripping me like a vice. I could hear him now, his breathing ragged and his weight pressing against the door. Without thinking, I bolted to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold it, but the cold metal brought me a faint sense of security. My phone sat on the coffee table, just out of reach, but I didn't dare turn my back on the door. I stood frozen, listening to the relentless rattling, until a sudden, sharp slam shook the entire frame. He was throwing his shoulder into the door now, and the lock creaked under the strain. I grabbed my phone, fumbling with it as I dialed 911. "Someone's trying to break in," I whispered into the receiver, my voice trembling as tears streamed down my face. "Please, send someone. I'm so scared." The operator stayed on the line, her calm voice a lifeline as she assured me help was on the way. But the seconds dragged on like hours, each slam against the door louder than the last. I could hear him cursing under his breath, his frustration mounting as the door held firm. My grip on the knife tightened, my knuckles white as I braced myself for what felt inevitable. And then, out of nowhere, a booming voice cut through the chaos. "Hey! What the hell do you think you're doing?" My neighbor, Mr. Clark, was standing on his porch across the street, his figure illuminated by the glow of his porch light. He was an older man, well into his 60s, and not someone I'd ever pegged as the confrontational type. But his voice carried enough authority to make the man outside my door freeze. The pounding stopped, and I heard hurried footsteps retreating down the porch steps. A wave of relief washed over me, but I stayed where I was, too afraid to move until the sound of sirens filled the air. Minutes later, police officers were swarming the property, their flashlights sweeping through the yard and the dark corners of the street. One of them knocked on the door, and I finally felt safe enough to unlock it, my hands still trembling. The man hadn't gone far. They found him hiding in a backyard a few houses down, a knife tucked into his pocket. When the officers returned to update me, one of them said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You did the right thing by not opening the door," he said. "This guy's been lurking in the neighborhood all day." He wasn't looking for help, he was looking for a target. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I installed security cameras, reinforced my locks, and added motion-activated lights around the property. But even with all those precautions, the fear lingered. Every knock at the door felt like a threat, every shadow a potential danger. That night changed something in me, a realization of how quickly an ordinary evening could spiral into something out of a nightmare. Living alone, once a symbol of independence and freedom, now felt like an invitation for the worst kind of danger. And though the man was caught, his shadow still looms in my mind, a constant reminder that safety is never guaranteed. The evening started like any other. I had just finished dinner, and the only illumination in the room was the faint glow of the television. Outside, the world was cloaked in darkness, my backyard particularly so, with no streetlights to cast even the faintest shadows. The woods behind my house made it feel even more isolated, their stillness amplifying the eerie quiet of the night. At around 8 p.m., the power suddenly went out. While not entirely unusual, outages weren't exactly common in my area. With an irritated sigh, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, deciding to check the breaker box to see if it was just my house or the entire neighborhood. As I stood up, a flicker of movement caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. A light, narrow and deliberate, cut through the inky blackness of my backyard. My body froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I squinted at the window, the beam of light moving slowly, deliberately, as though whoever held it was searching for something. My backyard was fenced, secure, or so I thought. No one should have been back there. For a brief moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor? But that thought didn't hold. Why would anyone be wandering through my yard? And with a flashlight? I crouched down, staying low as I crept toward the window, careful to remain out of sight. With trembling hands, I peered through the corner of the curtain, just enough to get a glimpse without revealing myself. The sight that greeted me made my stomach drop. A man stood in the yard, his face obscured by the hood of a dark sweatshirt. He held a flashlight in one hand, its beam illuminating the grass, and in the other, something long and metallic. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as he moved closer to the back door, the light caught it, a crowbar. Panic surged through me as the reality set in. This wasn't some lost pedestrian or a curious neighbor. He was here with a purpose, and it wasn't good. My mind raced as I ducked back down, heart hammering in my chest. I needed to act fast. Crawling to the other side of the room, I reached for my phone, trying to keep my movements as silent as possible. My fingers shook so badly I almost dropped it as I dialed 911. When the operator answered, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's someone in my backyard. He has a crowbar. Please, send someone." The operator remained calm, her steady voice grounding me just enough to keep from spiraling. She told me to find a safe place to hide and stay on the line. With my phone's flashlight pointed at the floor to avoid drawing attention, I crept down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards feeling deafening in the quiet. I chose the bathroom. It was in the middle of the house, with no windows, and the door had a lock. Once inside, I gently closed the door, locked it, and slid into the bathtub. Turning off my flashlight, I sat there in the darkness, clutching the phone to my chest as I tried to calm my ragged breathing. The operator asked me to describe what I was hearing, and I strained to listen. At first, there was only silence, but then came the sound I had been dreading, the unmistakable crash of shattering glass. My blood ran cold. He was inside. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way, but time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. The intruder's footsteps echoed through the house, heavy and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. Each step seemed calculated, as though he knew he had the upper hand. My heart felt like it might burst as I heard him moving from room to room, opening doors and shifting objects. It was clear he was searching. I gripped the phone tighter, my fingers cramping as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The sound of his movements grew closer, each creak of the floorboards sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't think to check the bathroom. Then, through the phone, I heard it, voices shouting outside. The police had arrived. Relief flooded me, but I didn't dare move. Moments later, there was a loud bang, followed by the sound of a door slamming and hurried footsteps. More shouting ensued, and then the muffled sounds of a struggle. It wasn't until I heard a knock on the bathroom door and an officer's voice telling me it was safe that I finally allowed myself to exhale. I hesitated, my hand still shaking as I unlocked the door and stepped out. The scene in my living room was surreal. The intruder was lying face down on the floor, handcuffed, his hoodie pulled back to reveal a face that was shockingly ordinary. That somehow made it worse. He wasn't some monster from a nightmare, just an average-looking man who had been on the verge of shattering my world. The officers explained that he was a known burglar who had been targeting homes in the area. They commended me for calling when I did, saying that if I had tried to confront him or flee, the situation could have ended very differently. Their words were meant to reassure me, but they only deepened the unease that had settled in my chest. This was my home, my safe space, and it had been violated. In the weeks that followed, I did everything I could to restore a sense of security. I installed motion-activated lights, upgraded my locks, and put up security cameras. But no matter how many precautions I took, I couldn't shake the fear. Every little noise set me on edge, every shadow felt like a potential threat. I stopped sitting in the dark altogether, too afraid of what I might see, or what might see me. That night changed me. Living alone had always been a source of pride, a testament to my independence. But now, it felt like a vulnerability, a glaring invitation for danger. The thought that someone could so easily shatter the illusion of safety I had built for myself was a lesson I would never forget. Safety, I realized, isn't guaranteed, it's a fragile, fleeting thing. And while the intruder was caught, the fear he left behind remains, a shadow that lingers in every corner of my mind. After my recent breakup, I moved into a modest one-bedroom house in Plano, Texas. It was far from luxurious, but it was affordable and peaceful, exactly the reset I needed. The neighborhood, while unassuming, seemed safe. For the first couple of months, life was uneventful. My days were filled with work and quiet evenings spent unwinding in the solitude I'd come to appreciate. My bedroom window faced the side yard, where I'd planted a few bushes that were already showing signs of neglect. I kept the blinds drawn most of the time, enjoying the privacy they offered. It started on a Tuesday night. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, the rhythmic hum of a typical day behind me, work, dinner, and a quick jog around the block. The house was quiet except for the faint creaks of settling wood. That's when I heard it, a sound so subtle I almost missed it. At first, I thought it was just the wind brushing against the bushes or perhaps the neighbor's cat wandering through the yard. But as I listened closer, the noise sharpened into something deliberate. Slow, heavy footsteps crunched on the dry leaves outside my window. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Those steps were too heavy to belong to an animal, too purposeful to be random. Holding my breath, I sat up slightly, straining to hear more. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped, directly beneath the window. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I stared at the blinds, half expecting them to be ripped aside by an unseen figure. But nothing happened. Minutes dragged by, and eventually, the sound of footsteps faded into the night. The next morning, I stepped into the yard to look for any sign of a trespasser. The grass near the bushes was trampled in places, and a few branches appeared bent, as though someone had brushed against them. My stomach churned, but there was no evidence strong enough to suggest real danger. I convinced myself it was probably a passerby cutting through the yard, though I knew how unlikely that was. For a brief moment, I considered calling the police, but I dismissed the thought, telling myself I was overreacting. The next night, the footsteps returned. This time, they lingered. I was in bed again, hoping the previous evening had been a one-off incident, when the now familiar sound of deliberate steps echoed outside. They moved slowly, back and forth, as though someone was pacing. I lay there motionless, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced with scenarios, each one worse than the last. Still, I couldn't bring myself to look. I stayed rooted in place, clutching the blanket as if it could somehow shield me from the unknown. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the oppressive silence returned. By the third night, I was unraveling. The thought of hearing those footsteps again made me dread going to bed, but staying awake all night wasn't a viable solution. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., the footsteps came again, but this time, they didn't just linger near the window. I heard the distinct creak of the backyard gate being opened. My throat went dry, and I barely had the courage to breathe. The steps moved toward the back of the house, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel path. I couldn't bring myself to look outside, so I sat there in the dark, gripping my phone as if it were a lifeline. Over the next week, the footsteps became an unwelcome routine. Sometimes they stayed by the window, other nights they circled the house, as if whoever was out there was scoping out the property. I started double-checking all the locks on the windows and doors, but it did little to calm my nerves. One night, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the edge of the blinds, a fleeting flicker of movement that sent my heart racing. I sat frozen, clutching a kitchen knife I'd started keeping by the bed. The shadow didn't return, but I couldn't convince myself it had been my imagination. 2 weeks later, just as I was beginning to hope the mysterious figure had moved on, I was proven wrong. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of my window rattling. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but as I stared at the blinds, I saw them move slightly. Someone was trying to force the window open. My body felt paralyzed with fear, my brain screaming at me to act, but I couldn't move. I could only watch in horror as a pale, dirty hand slipped through a small gap at the bottom of the window, fumbling for the lock. A surge of adrenaline jolted me out of my paralysis, and I let out a blood-curdling scream. The hand froze mid-motion, and for a moment, the air was so still I could hear my own frantic heartbeat. Then, just as abruptly, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the night. The window stopped rattling, but I couldn't stop shaking. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911 with trembling hands, barely able to form coherent sentences as I explained what had happened. The operator assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay put. When the police arrived, they searched the yard and surrounding area. Though the intruder was gone, they found clear signs of their presence: trampled grass, scuffed dirt near the gate, and fingerprints smudged on the glass. The officers told me I had done the right thing by calling immediately. "You're lucky you woke up when you did," one of them said. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. That night marked a turning point for me. I couldn't live with the constant dread of what might happen next. I upgraded my home security, installing motion-activated floodlights and cameras that covered every angle of the property. I reinforced the locks and even added a security bar to the back door. But no amount of precaution could erase the fear that had taken root. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the house, sent my heart racing. Living alone, once a source of peace and independence, now felt like a constant battle to keep myself safe from unseen threats. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. Every knock at the door makes my stomach tighten with unease. Every shadow in the corner of my eye sets my nerves on edge. That night taught me a hard lesson: safety is an illusion, one that can shatter in an instant. I can only hope I'll never have to face that kind of terror again, but the scars it left behind remind me to always stay vigilant. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed into the night, fading quickly as whoever had been outside retreated into the shadows. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone as I fumbled to dial 911. The operator's calm voice guided me through the panic, but I couldn't stop the rising dread. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was long gone. Officers combed the yard and found footprints leading from the window to the back gate, which hung slightly ajar. They urged me to stay vigilant and consider upgrading my home security, though their reassurances did little to ease my anxiety. Even now, I shudder at the thought of how close I came to real danger that night. Who was this person, and what were they planning? The unanswered questions gnawed at me, and the realization that I could have been harmed, or worse, was a weight I couldn't shake. If I hadn't woken up when I did, the outcome might have been unthinkable. In the days that followed, I made a point to fortify my home. Security cameras were installed, their lenses capturing every angle of the property. Reinforced locks now bolted every door and window, and motion sensor lights turned the once dark corners of my yard into bright beacons at the slightest movement. I even kept my phone by my side at all times, unwilling to be caught off guard again. Yet, despite the precautions, the fear remained, coiled tightly in the back of my mind like a predator waiting to pounce. It's been months since that night, and the unease still clings to me. Every time I hear an unfamiliar noise, my heart skips a beat. The creak of the house settling, the rustle of the wind through the bushes, all of it makes my pulse quicken. I've stopped feeling entirely safe in my own home, a space that once brought me comfort and peace. Now, it feels like I'm constantly bracing for something to happen, as though the intruder's shadow never fully left. Looking back, that night was a harsh lesson in vigilance and preparedness. I've learned to trust my instincts, to act on that uneasy feeling in my gut rather than brushing it aside. Safety, I've come to understand, is not something to take for granted. It's a fragile construct, one that can be shattered in an instant by the wrong person or the wrong moment. The experience left me with scars, not the visible kind, but the kind that creep into your thoughts when the lights are low and the house feels too quiet. I've tried to move on, to reclaim the sense of security I once had, but it's a battle I'm still fighting. And while I've done everything I can to protect myself, there's a part of me that will never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next time my sanctuary might be threatened. That's it for today's story from the Shivering Vault. If you've had a chilling experience or a close call, share your tale in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and spread the word to fellow thrill seekers. Until next time, thank you for unlocking another tale, and remember, the vault is always waiting for your return.